Good morning, everyone. I am Cristel Jean C. Blanco, and I will be reporting Marxist-Dependency Theory together with my groupmate Rachel Bautista. So, according to Raul Pribich, Director of United Nations Economic Commissions for Latin America and his colleagues, he said that troubled by the fact that economic growth in the advanced countries did not necessarily lead to growth of poorer countries. So it says that economic activity of richer countries leads to serious economic problems. Privileged initial explanation. Poor countries exported primary commodities to rich countries. So if they export products or commodities to other countries, then we have this what we call the value added or the value added tax, which means manufacturing a usable product always costs more than the primary products used to create those products. So if a product has a price of a minimum price, then if it will be exported to the rich countries, mapatungan na ang price ato nga product kay ilahan naman tong i ilahan na tong i sell to the market. So we have three issues of made this policy difficult to follow. Number one, internal markets of the poor countries were not large enough to support the economies of scale used by rich countries to keep their prices low. So, ang mga markets sa poor countries are not capable enough to support the ang economy nila used by rather than the rich countries nga masupport gyud nila ilahang economic growth to keep their prices low. And number two, political will of the poor countries as to whether a transformation from being primary products producers was possible or desirable. So the political will of the poor countries, um, whether the transformation of being primary producers, mo na siya, through transformation sa from poor country nga ma-transform siya, makuan po ilahang mga products. Then number three, poorer countries control of their primary products, selling those products abroad. So, the poor countries control nila ilahang primary products to sell those products abroad. For example, here in the Philippines, we are exporting um, our products like bananas to other countries. So, kana like um, mga big plantation sa bananas ga store na sila og mga products sa bananas, mga products ng bananas to export to other countries and to sell it. Dependency theory. Possible way of explaining the persistent poverty of the poor countries. So, um, the solution of privilege is that poor countries, uh, its solution is that poorer countries should provide programs of import substitution. So there will be um, there will be no need to purchase the manufactured products from from richer countries. So um, so uh, so the its solution, Pribich said that one solution of it is that poor countries should provide programs to import substitution. So big programs para makahelp sa farmers, and they will not need to purchase the manufactured products from richer countries. So ang katong, for example, katong mga bananas nga gisell sa poor country dito sa richer country, dili na ta mag-import og kadto nga products gikan sa ilaha padulong diri sa ato ang nasod, instead of um, making programs to have import substitution. Then Teotonio dos Santos emphasizes the historical dimension of the dependency relationship in his definition. Um, he said that an historical condition which shapes a certain structure of the world economy, such it favors some countries to detriment of others and limits the development possibilities of the subordinate economics. So there are three common features of these definitions. Number one, international system in into two sets of states, the dominant or dependent and center or periphery and metropolitan or satellite. So number two, both definitions have in common the assumption of external forces are the singular importance to the economic activities within the dependent states. Um, then number three, definitions of dependency indicate that relations between dominant and dependent states are dynamic, so it changes over time. So the structural the structural content of dependency the structural content of dependency, is it capitalism or is it power? According to this view, the capitalist system has enforced a rigid international division of labor which is responsible for the underdevelopment of many areas of the world. So, it also states that dependency model um, shows that rest upon the assumption that economic and political power are heavily concentrated and centralized in the industrialized countries. So, ang dependency model daw kuno as an assumption that both economic and political power concentrate pa siya and uh, even centralized only daw on industrial countries. So if this assumption is valid, then any distinction between economic and political power is spurious. Governments will take whatever steps are necessary to protect private economic interests. So, ang government will take action na dayon to protect private economic interests daw. So, um, they also said that Marxist theory of imperialism merely explains dominant state expansion, while dependency theories explains more on underdevelopment. So, for the dependency theorist, for them, underdevelopment is a wholly negative condition which offers no possibility of sustained and autonomous economic activity in a dependent state. So, for them, underdevelopment is a negative condition nga wala jay posibilidad nga masustain nimo ang economic activity on that dependent state or country or anang isa ka lugar. So, next is the central propositions of dependency theory. So, number one, underdevelopment. This refers to a situation in which resources are being actively used, but used in a way which benefits dominant states and not the poor states in which the resources are found. So, underdevelopment, dili even ang pag-distribute sa resources because what's the dominant state man good ang ga-benefit the most and not the poorer state nga didto gyud nakuha ang resources. Then in contrast, the difference of underdevelopment and undevelopment is that undevelopment is a condition in which sources are not being used. So wala gyud siya gamit, wala nila um gigamit ang unsa nga resources sa nga lugar, wala nila tagaag development ingana. So the distinction of underdevelopment and development places the poorer countries of the world is a profoundly different historical context. 3. Dependency theory suggests that alternative uses of resources are preferably to the resource usage patterns imposed by dominant states. 4. The preceding so number 3 nasa number 3, there is no clear definition of what these preferred patterns might be, but some criteria are invoked. For example, one of the dominant state practices most often criticized by dependency theorists is export agriculture. The criticism is that many poor economies experience rather high rates of malnutrition even though they produce great amounts of food for export. Many dependency theorists would argue that those agricultural lands should be used for domestic food production in order to reduce the rates of malnutrition. So, mali siya example sa number 3. Number 4, the preceding proposition can be amplified. Dependency theorists rely upon a belief that there exists a clear national economic interest which can and should be articulated for each country. So in respect, dependency theory actually shares a similar theoretical concern with realism. What distinguishes the dependency perspective is that its proponents believe that this national interest can only be satisfied by addressing the needs of the poor within a society, rather than through the satisfaction of corporate and or governmental needs. Trying to determine what is best for the poor is a difficult analytical problem over the long run. Dependency theorists have not yet articulated an operational definition of the national economic interest. Number 5, the diversion of resources over time is maintained, not only by the power of the dominant states, but also through the power of elites in the dependent states. So, this explains that dependency theorists argued that these elites maintain a dependent relationship because their own private interests coincide with the interests of the dominant states. These elites are typically trained in the dominant states and share similar values and culture with the elites in the dominant states. Thus, in a very real sense, a dependency relationship is a voluntary relationship. One need to argue that the elites in a dependent states are consciously betraying the interests of the poor. The elites sincerely believe that the key to economic development lies in following the prescriptions of the liberal economic doctrine. And this, the policy implication of dependency analysis. So if one accepts the analysis of dependency theory, then the questions of how poor economies develop become quite different from the traditional questions concerning comparative advantage, capital accumulation, and import or export strategies. So some of the most important new issues include the success of the advanced industrial economies does not serve a model for the currently developing countries. So when economies developed became a focused area of study, the analytical strategy was quite clear. All nations need to emulate the patterns used by the rich countries. So indeed, in 1950s and 1960s, there was a paradigmatic consensus that growth strategies were universally applicable, a consensus best articulated by Walt Rostow in his book The Stages of Economic Growth. So, dependency theory suggests that the success of the richer countries was highly contingent and specific episode on global economic history, one dominated by the highly exploitative colonial relationships of European powers. So, a repeat of those relationships is not now highly likely for the poor countries of the world. And number two, dependency theory repudiates the central distributive mechanism of the neoclassical model, what is usually called trickle-down economics. The new classical model of economic growth pays relatively little attention to the question of distribution of wealth. Its primary concern is on efficient production and assumes that the market will allocate the rewards of efficient production in a rational and unbiased manner. This assumption may be valid for a well-integrated, economically fluid economy where people can quickly adjust to economic changes and where consumption patterns are not distorted by non-economic forces such as racial, ethnic, or gender bias. These conditions are not pervasive in the developing economies, and dependency theories argue that economic activity is not easily disseminated in poor countries. For these structural reasons, dependency theories argue that the market alone is not a sufficient distributive mechanism. And number three, since the market only rewards productivity, dependency theories discount aggregate measures of economic growth such as the GDP or trace indices. Dependency theorists do not deny that economic activities occur within an independent state. They do not make a very important distinction, however, between economic growth and economic development. For example, there is a great concern within the dependency framework for whether the economic activity is actually benefiting the nation as a whole. Therefore, far greater attention is paid to indices such as life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, education, and the like. Dependency theories clearly emphasize social indicators far more than economic indicators. And lastly, dependent states should attempt to pursue policies of self-reliance. Contrary to the neoclassical models endorsed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, greater integration into the global economy is not necessarily a good choice for poor countries. Often, this policy perspective is viewed as an endorsement of a policy of autarky, and there have been some experiments with such policy, such as China's Great Leap Forward or Tanzania's policy of Ujamaa. The failures of these policies are clear, and the failure suggests that autarky is not a good choice. Rather, a policy of self-reliance should be interpreted as endorsing a policy of controlled interactions with the world economy. Poor countries should only endorse interactions on terms that promise to improve the social economic welfare of the larger citizenry. So, this will the end of my report. Thank you for listening and God bless.